Good, welcome back to a new knighthood. In earlier episodes we laid the foundation, the origins of knighthood, the testimony of Geoffrey de Charny, the ideal of Peradja, and the archetypal psychology of Robert Elmore. Now we turn to the realms of medieval Europe, the political worlds where knighthood was lived. We begin with the Kingdom of France around the year 1100, and the map of powers that made the North and the South such profoundly different worlds. But before we begin, if these episodes are useful to you, please like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments. I really enjoy hearing from you. France in the year 1100 is a kingdom in the loosest sense of the word, being a patchwork of feudal domains and relationships between lords and vassals. The King of France sits in his palace, crowned and anointed, successor to Charlemagne and Clovis, the first king of the Franks. His actual domain, however, stretches barely 120 kilometers. Paris on the Seine, Orléans on the Loire, and the territories between. Beyond that thin strip, the great lords of the realm often do as they please. Normandy lies to the north, its ducal house entangled with the English crown. Anjou and Maine hold the southwest, aggressive and expanding. Brittany to the west was never fully tamed by any Carolingian. Flanders sits to the northeast, wealthy beyond any royal revenue. Champagne commands the east, Burgundy the southeast, and above all, Aquitaine dominates the southwest beyond the Loire, nearly a third of the territory we now call France, and most of it Occitan in language and culture. That Occitan world extends beyond Aquitaine, through Toulouse, Narbonne, and the deeper Languedoc, where Peradja is lived and the king in Paris is close to a rumour. Together, these lands answer almost entirely to themselves. This is the world the Capetian kings inherited. To understand what they built over the next 2 centuries, and at what cost, we first have to examine how little they actually held. When Urga Capet was elected King of the Franks in 987, he inherited a title, not power. His family, the Robertians, had provided kings before, during the troubled final years of the Carolingian Empire, under the heirs of Charlemagne. But Urga's coronation didn't give him control of France, it gave him legitimacy and very little else. The royal domain was shockingly small. Paris, Orléans, and the territories between them, bridging the Seine and the Loire. Even within this tiny heartland, the king struggled to maintain order. Bandits, rebellious castellans, and minor nobles operated with near impunity. The rest of the kingdom was held by vassals who were vassals in theory only. They owed homage to the king and acknowledged his symbolic authority. In practice, they did what they wanted. By 1100, the situation hadn't improved much. King Philippe I, who ruled from 1060 to 1108, had managed modest territorial gains and maintained the stability of the royal line, but he remained hemmed in by powers greater than his own. The pattern that the chroniclers keep returning to is this. The great lords treated royal authority as a useful fiction, a source of legitimacy, a court of last resort when their own disputes grew unmanageable. Something to anchor the sacred order of Christendom. What they did not recognize, and what the king had no means to compel, was obedience. They wanted a figurehead, not a real ruler. The great vassals of the king weren't just regional nobles. They were regional powers, and each had its own character, its own resources, and its own trajectory. Normandy, after 1066, had braided itself together with the English crown, as we saw in the Bayeux Tapestry. By 1100, William the Conqueror's 3 surviving sons held the inheritance between them, and the arrangement was unstable. Robert Curthose, the eldest, held the duchy and was only returning from the First Crusade in September of that year. William II, known as Rufus, held England as king. The youngest, Henry, held neither. until William Rufus died in the New Forest on August 2nd, 1100, and Henry seized England within days. 6 years later, at the Battle of Tanchebray in 1106, Henry defeated Robert and reunited the Anglo-Norman realm under one ruler. For most of the 12th century, the Duke of Normandy and the King of England would be the same man, a vassal who outweighed his lord. Anjou, just south of Normandy, was expanding aggressively under a succession of capable counts. By 1154, the House of Anjou, then named the Plantagenets, would hold Normandy, Maine, Aquitaine, and the English crown, creating a territorial bloc that dwarfed the royal domain many times over. Brittany to the west maintained a distinctive Celtic language and identity. Never fully incorporated by Charlemagne or his successors, the Breton dukes acknowledged Frankish sovereignty when convenient and ignored it otherwise. Flanders to the north was already one of the wealthiest regions in Europe. Its emerging cloth trade and strategic coastal position generated revenues no royal domain could match. Baldwin V, Count of Flanders, had served as regent of France from 1060 to 1067. Flemish importance in international politics was already established, and his daughter Matilda married William the Conqueror, linking Flanders to both Normandy and England. Champagne to the east controlled the trade routes that would soon make the Champagne fairs famous. Burgundy, further southeast, was held by a Cadets branch of the Capetian line from 1032, a part of the royal family in theory, but operating largely independently in practice. Aquitaine in the southwest was the largest and richest duchy in France, stretching from the Loire to the Pyrenees, from the Atlantic to the Massif Central. Dynastically stable, it was ruled from 1086 to 1126 by Guillaume IX, the first troubadour we know by name. Under him, the ducal court became one of the most vital in Europe, a place of poetry, music, wit, and a refined culture of love and excellence that would set the template for courtly life across Christendom. The church excommunicated Guillaume twice, and his crusade of 1101 ended in military disaster. But what the priests called scandal, his court called life. Culturally, most of Aquitaine was Occitan. The Languedoc flourished and Paragia took root. And beyond Aquitaine, in the deeper south, in Toulouse, Narbonne, and the lands around them, royal authority was not merely weak, it was nominal at best. Of all these powers, the Duchy of Normandy posed the most acute threat to the Capetians. The problem was structural. Once Normandy and the Kingdom of England was held by the same man, it could muster vast combined resources: English revenues, Norman military strength, and strategic control of the English Channel. The Duke was the French king's vassal for Normandy, owing homage and feudal service, but he was also a crowned king in his own right, the French king's equal in status. This created an impossible situation. When a Norman English ruler came to pay homage for his French lands, he came as a subordinate, but he could turn around and demand homage from other lords, some of whom also owed allegiance to the French crown. The feudal system, which was supposed to create clear hierarchies, instead created competing loyalties and constant tension. Already before they became the kings of England, the Norman rulers understood this perfectly. They rarely traveled to the French court. They sent minimal military service, a few dozen men for 40 days, though they could raise thousands. They operated their duchy as a quasi-sovereign state, minting coins, dispensing justice, and conducting foreign policy without reference to Paris. For the French king, this meant facing a vassal who controlled more territory, commanded more soldiers, and collected more revenue than he did. The Duke of Normandy could be contained through diplomacy and alliance building, but he could not be controlled. The Norman problem would define French royal policy for the next century. The Capetians needed to either break Norman power or expand their own domain to match it. They would eventually choose to do both. The Occitan south wasn't just a problem for the Capetians, it was almost a different world. The territories where Occitan was spoken, meaning the majority of Aquitaine, Toulouse and the lands around them, operated with almost complete autonomy from the Capetian crown. This wasn't defiance, it was simply reality. Royal authority had never penetrated here effectively, and by 1100 it had faded almost entirely. The Count of Toulouse ruled from the Mediterranean to the Massif Central. The lords of Narbonne and dozens of smaller domains conducted their affairs with little regard for Paris. When they needed arbitration or alliance, they sought out other regional powers. Increasingly, they looked across the Pyrenees to the county of Barcelona under Ramon Berenguer III. His court spoke a language essentially continuous with their own. They also looked to the Kingdom of Aragon under Pedro I and then Alfonso I, known as the Battler, which was becoming a major force on the frontier with Al-Andalus, Muslim southern Iberia. This near-autonomy created the conditions for the cultural flowering we discussed in the episode on Paraje. With little northern interference, Occitan courts developed their own values, their own literature, their own ways of organizing society. The Troubadours sang in the Languedoc, not French, known as the Languedoil. Paraje, earned nobility proved through action, took root here precisely because royal authority was effectively absent. The Capetians made occasional gestures toward the south. Robert II, the Pious, who ruled from 996 to 1031, made royal tours through southern territories to maintain symbolic connections. But these were rare, and they accomplished little. The Occitan south remained effectively independent. This division between north and south, linguistic, cultural, political, would have profound consequences. When the French crown eventually extended its power southward in the 13th century, during the Albigensian Crusade, it would not be unification. It would be conquest, the suppression of a flourishing culture by another within the same Christendom. But in 1100 that was more than a century away. The Occitan world existed as a parallel France, one that shared a nominal king and almost nothing else. Given all this weakness, how did the Capetian dynasty survive at all? The answer comes in three parts: luck, legitimacy, and longevity. First, luck. From Hugues Capet's election in 987 to the death of Philippe IV in 1314, a span of 327 years, 11 Capetian kings held the throne. Each ruled for an average of roughly 30 years. Throughout this period, direct father-to-son succession in the senior line was never broken. This was extraordinary. In England, the drowning of Henry I's only legitimate son, William Adelin, in the White Ship disaster of 1120 produced a succession crisis that eventually erupted into the anarchy. A brutal civil war from 1135 to 1153 between Stephen of Blois and the Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I. For nearly 2 decades, England and Normandy was torn apart over the succession. The Holy Roman Empire saw repeated succession crises of its own, but the Capetians produced heirs, had them survive to adulthood, and established a pattern of uncontested succession that became self-reinforcing. The longer the pattern held, the more natural it seemed that a Capetian should be king. Second, legitimacy. The Capetians were anointed kings crowned with sacred oil recognized by the church. This gave them something their more powerful vassals lacked: religious sanction. The great lords might control more territory, but the king represented a divinely authorized order. This wasn't practical power, but it was real authority. The Capetians cultivated it carefully. They emphasized their connection to Charlemagne and Clovis, to the sacred history of Francia. They developed royal symbols, the most important being the Oriflamme banner kept at the Abbey of Saint-Denis, which would be taken up in times of crisis. They positioned themselves as arbiters between feuding lords, as guarantors of peace, as the center that held. Third, patience. The great feudal houses played for dramatic gains, conquests, bold marriages, the sudden accumulation of titles. Such gains were often followed by crisis. The Capetians did none of this. They expanded when the opportunity allowed, held what they had when it didn't, and otherwise waited. Generation after generation, they added a lordship here, absorbed a fief there, made an advantageous marriage. Over 3 centuries, small consistent gains compounded into dominance. Thus they avoided overreach. Unlike the Carolingians who had tried to assert full theoretical power, the Capetians focused on what was achievable, mastering their own modest domain, building administrative capacity, and establishing legitimacy over time. They didn't try to exert immediate dominance over France. They tried to become indispensable to it. By 1100, this strategy was beginning to work. The Capetians were still weak, but they were stable, and stability in medieval politics was a resource all its own. The big question of medieval political history is almost always the same. What holds a place or region together, and at what cost? In 1100, what held France together was the thinnest thread of feudal legitimacy, draped across a political landscape that was, in every practical respect, independent. The King of France was the center of a symbolic system. Everything else answered to itself. That fragmentation was not only a structural weakness, it was also the condition for something else. With little northern interference, the Occitan courts produced the Troubadour tradition and the concept of parage. Regional identities deepened, local culture flourished. Much of what enriches our picture of medieval Europe grew precisely in the spaces the king couldn't reach. Over the next 2 centuries, the Capetians would systematically close those spaces. Philip II Augustus would break Plantagenet power and absorb Normandy. Louis VIII and Louis IX would extend royal authorities southward through the Albigensian Crusade and its aftermath. Philip IV would become powerful enough to dictate terms to popes and emperors. It was a slow centralization. It eventually crushed what the fragmentation had protected: the independent courts of Occitania, the distinctive culture of the south, the local identities that made medieval France so varied. Every wrinkle would slowly be ironed out in the name of order. The questions any honest account of this period has to ask are these: what kind of order, and paid for with what? Here's where the history turns personal, grounded in the archetypal. You face the same question at a different scale. Your life is fragmented right now. Competing commitments pull you in different directions. Projects sit half-started. Relationships need attention and don't get it. Parts of your life operate independently with no coordination between them. Your health, your work, your relationships, your creative pursuits, all running on separate tracks. The tyrant's response is to impose rigid control, eliminate everything that doesn't serve a single goal, crush autonomy, centralize everything around one priority. This creates order, but it also kills vitality. It's the French royal solution, effective and deadening. The weakling's response is to avoid the problem. Let the fragmentation continue, hope it resolves itself, never decide what actually matters most. This preserves freedom and guarantees chaos at length. Nothing gets done well because nothing gets sustained attention. Mature sovereign energy does something different. It orders without eliminating. It creates structures that rank and coordinate the fragments without destroying what's valuable in them. Your challenge until next time is identifying one area of fragmentation in your life. Start with just one. Maybe it's conflicting time commitments. Maybe it's projects competing for attention. Maybe it's relationships you're neglecting because other things seem urgent. Don't try to solve it through tyrannical control, eliminating everything but one priority. Don't avoid it through weakling passivity, letting it continue and hoping for the best. Instead, create a structure that orders the fragments without destroying them. Maybe it's a schedule that allocates time to each area. Maybe it's a decision about what gets priority this month, while the others are maintained at minimum. Maybe it's a conversation that coordinates instead of demands. Then notice what happens. Does creating order feel tyrannical? Are you tempted to just control everything? Or does avoiding the decision feel easier even though the chaos continues? The Capetians spent 2 centuries centralizing France. You have a couple of weeks to practice creating order in one area of your life without becoming a tyrant. Document what you learn, your actions and their results. And you can share in the comments, what fragmentation did you address? What structure did you create? And was there a cost? In the next episode we will explore Iberia circa 1100. Thank you for watching.